Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode 4 of The Scheme of Things. This is Zaki.
And this is Tala.
Talha, winters are finally here. You can see I'm wearing my hoodie and the cold here in Rawalpindi side is unbearable. What's going on in Islamabad?
I think it can be either cold in Rawalpindi, and I believe I read your tweet. It was like you have written that there is Sarmi in Rawalpindi, 70 plus Garmi, you call it.
Yes.
But here in Islamabad, especially since I'm sitting in this sector that is closer to the mountains. There is this considerable chill in the air.
I live in the hilly area as well, so mine is not that congested in area. So the buildings are not so close to each other. It's quite an open hilly area, so you really get the chills. When I come back from the office, and it's just. But the good thing is it's soup season, so I think that's one of the plus points of welcoming winters. And then of course we have reudi, which is the local delicacy. I don't know how to translate that into English. I went to another city recently, and on my way back, I passed through Chakwal. And the reudi from Chakwal, that sweet dish from Chakwal, is extremely delicious. The Pelwan ki reudi.
Palwan ki reudi, yes, exactly.
Yes. So I have the stock with me in case you're interested. I can parcel it to you.
Sure, it's always welcome.
So, and I was just, we were talking behind the scenes before we started recording. You were mentioning about The Crown. And interestingly, I've been watching it as well. What was your impression of season 4?
I think overall, I liked the production, but they could have apart from all the happenings of the royal family, they could have shed more light or dedicated some more time to the Falkland Wars. And also, I was very much interested in the happenings of the Commonwealth, the, the
The dynamics, basically. The whole aspect of Elizabeth's control, I think you were focusing on that.
yes, the dynamics between Margaret Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth.
Thatcherism. Yes, yes.
Thatcherism. So how she was opposed to this application of sanctions on South Africa and the other
So what
Commonwealth countries.
what was your impression of that scene? Because at first I thought that Queen Elizabeth was genuinely interested in the humanitarian aspect of South Africa, but then I had this other assumption that maybe she was just trying to stick out in favor of the other 48 countries who had opposed South Africa because her father, the late King George, had advised her to support the Commonwealth majority at all costs. So, what was your impression? I thought that I was confused whether she was acting out of humanity in view of the apartheid, or she was just lending blind support to the majority of Commonwealth.
For that, I think I personally need to do more research on the motivations that prompted her to come in support of the other countries of the Commonwealth. But I think there was this humanitarian considerations played a role. In my opinion, humanitarian considerations were there in that decision. It wasn't solely about politics. There was this humanitarian impulse, especially if you see how they have visualized this that time they saw you can see these protests going on in Britain. So I think that the producers wanted to give this impression that there was this humanitarian impulse, this motivation that also factored in Elizabeth's decision uh, to go with what the other Commonwealth nations were looking at.
My overall takeaway. I don't know about you, but I found season 4 to be too much of focused on the relationship between Charles and Camilla and Diana as compared to something of substance. Because I particularly found season two to be the most interesting. The Churchill period, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
That
yes.
was very well produced because it focused on events, also the Suez Canal event and all of that, instead of the personalities.
Yes, in fact, this except for the season four, the earlier seasons were too much invested into the politics of Britain, depicting the politics of Britain. So that was a learning experience for me. Uh, After Churchill, there are other prime ministers. I learned a lot from Crown, especially because you can like always go and refer to the history books, and that is what I do. That is, I'm sure that is what you do. But it is always it feels more engaging, and when you don't have time, recourse to these productions, these TV productions, movies, etc.
Yeah,
They become quite immersive. This is quite an immersive experience in itself.
I, I believe the
Learning is
term is infotainment.
infotainment. Yes. So
Exactly. So, what's your first topic for this episode, Talha?
okay. So what I will be discussing, our first topic for this video session is the appointment of certain cabinet members by President-elect Joe Biden. I'll be focusing on the appointment of Antony Blinken as the Secretary of State, what it portends for Middle East and South Asia in general. I'll also discuss um, the viewpoint of Michel Flournoy, the new Secretary of Defense, is slated to hold this portfolio in Biden's administration. So, Antony Blinken, deputy former uh, secretary during Obama's period, his views on Middle East are quite will be quite a departure from what we have seen. We have seen the politics under Trump. So there is this thing that the commentators generally, to those who are studying, those who have studied Blinken's profile, they say that he will call for greater emphasis on human rights in dealing with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Even the aid that is given to Egypt can be partially tied to human rights, and there will be a greater caution about arms sales to Saudi Arabia. His appointment will be reassuring for Israel. Uh, Blinken prefers dialogue with Israel on Palestinian rights rather than pressure tactics. He also believes that Israel should have a qualitative military edge, and he raised questions in the past. He raised questions about
Yeah,
F-35 shipments to UAE.
exactly.
Um, Vis-a-vis Turkey, they say that Blinken will be firm, but he won't risk any major breakdown of US-Turkey relations. And they have given this example that Blinken hesitated to respond to Erdogan's Hagia Sophia conversion. But with regards to Turkey's politics in the Mediterranean region, England is strongly opposed to how Turkey's solution to the Cyprus problem. Erdogan has talked about this two-state solution, and Blinken opposes that. He will be more hawkish on Syria. He supported military action on Assad in 2013.
Yes.
There is a possibility that if, in case, Syria uses chemical weapons again, this time there will be a very strong response. Because formerly, during Obama's time, there was the too much criticism was leveled at United States for its inaction, and this cannot be continued under Biden's. So there will be a more strong U.S. response this time if Syria goes into the usage of any munitions that is prohibited under international law. But a regime change mission will be unlikely. There are no chances of that. Another thing, then we have Iran. Blinken would support a return to Iran's nuclear deal.
That's going to be one of the major policy points for the incoming administration, Iran.
Yes, especially in fact, all the discussions, all the analyses are being contextualized on Middle East, are being contextualized on this point. Biden's administration is dealing with Iran. So, joint comprehensive plan of action, how how the things would progress. In fact, even Iran is vocal, has given this signal to this effect that they would welcome the involvement of the United States again. They have been very welcoming in the past few days. So now, done with the Middle East, let's look at how Blinken views India. So he was as Biden's campaign chief, foreign policy official. He was responsible. Blinken was responsible to give the order of the congratulatory calls that were coming from the rest of the world to President-elect. So he was responsible for setting the order. So Blinken, so quite interestingly, you see here that Narendra Modi was amongst the first leaders of the allied countries that Biden called, along with Benjamin Netanyahu. This
Yes.
is, I guess, this is reported in Washington Examiner. This point I just cherry picked from this place. So on China, Blinken considers China as a common challenge. He takes cognizance of China's aggression towards India at the line of actual control. And here we see that the appointment of Michelle Flournoy as the Secretary of Defense under Biden's administration, she also echoes a similar viewpoint. We would come to that later. But let's just look at how Blinken views India first. So Blinken has in the past, the quote unquote, these words are of Blinken's. We will be an advocate for India to play a leading role in international institutions, and that includes helping India get a seat uh, in the reforming process, uh, get a seat on the United Nations Security Council. We will work together to strengthen India's defense. It's a very tall claim coming from someone who is positioned to hold a very strong portfolio
Indeed.
under the new government. But still, with regards to how Blinken views China, there is this. There would be, I believe, there would be a departure from how the U.S. has been labeling China's counter-radicalization efforts. There will be a marked departure from this prior arrangement. Well, on China's dealing with Uyghurs, Blinken has praised China's counter-radicalization efforts. He has supported Beijing's efforts, and he has talked about it in. He has given some. He talked about it in an interview in 2015. So, but the thing, another thing is that Blinken will be reluctant to militarize the South China Sea. Uh, 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 some of the analysts who have gone through Blinken's profile, they consider that China will fare well under Biden's administration, and there is a chance that the Biden administration will go back into the Obama era appeasement mode vis-a-vis China. So this is sketch of how Blinken will be dealing with the world. But Blinken's views on China are still mellow when we see them when we analyze them in contrast with the views of the Secretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy. In her piece for FT, she has given an idea of what Biden administration may mean for the Indo-Pacific. So she has talked about how the Sino-Indian border dispute, and now these are Michelle Flournoy's words. She has talked about how the Sino-Indian border dispute underscores wider trends in the Indo-Pacific and should serve as a wake-up call for the region. And she has talked about earlier it was said that China is violating the norm of freedom of navigation, but Michelle Flournoy has widened the ambit. She is saying that she has said that China is also, there are two other norms that China is violating. The second norm that China, apart from the freedom of navigation, that is threatened by Chinese incursions.
Okay.
The second norm that China is violating is the inviolability of borders. And the third norm that China is violating is the norm of peaceful resolution of disputes. So, Michelle Flournoy has written that this dispute at Ladakh should serve as yet another wake-up call to accelerate and deepen security cooperation among like-minded states. And In a principle, it is a movement that demands US leadership to convene and mobilize the region's democracies. And it is a cherished legacy of sacrifices by the US, its allies, and partners that can only be preserved if the region's democracies recognize and take steps to protect their common interest and value. But here we come back to this point again that how will the United States be able to mobilize the region's democracy? That is a big question mark. Can it happen or can it not happen? This is what I have to present. This is my.
If I may ask you a question related to, because you've been studying the incoming administration, especially Mr. Blinken and Ms. Flournoy. It's a related question which just popped in my mind. I was going to talk on it, so I'm going to incorporate in this particular segment. A few days ago, the outgoing administration, US Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, he ordered the removal of East Turkestan Islamic Movement, erstwhile ETIM, which is nowadays known as the Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP. It is a terrorist and subversive organization targeting Chinese interests within China and overseas, including in areas of Pakistan. The Pakistan army has been successfully able to eradicate the presence of ETIM on its territory, and they're still actively regrouping in areas such as Afghanistan and some Central Asian republics. So as far as the policy toward China goes, and it's quite a big statement because ETIM was initially sanctioned and declared a terrorist by through various United Nations Security Council resolutions in 2002, and it was then administration of George Bush Jr. that had decided to include them in the Treasury Department sanctions, and officially the US, also being one of the global superpower, it declared them and viewed them as such. But now, do you think that this current administration, the State Department under Pompeo, I won't comment on the Department of Defense, that's a separate domain, but Pompeo's policies have been extremely aggressive toward China, directly targeting the CCP leadership. So, keeping the Defense Department aspect aside, if we only talk about the foreign policy angle, do you think that the deliberate targeting of China, and especially this particular aspect of going against the UN itself and the world community in actually having a soft corner for ETIM, do you think that is something that could be reversed, or is that that's going to take a lot of paperwork to reverse that decision? Or will they actually consider doing that?
We have to ask this question from ourselves that what the Trump administration has been doing in its dealing with China. Is this has this is this what they have strategized and what they have acted upon? Is this thing working? Quite frankly, I don't think that it is working as robustly as it is being claimed. Yes, there have been certain developments. There have been, as you have mentioned, this delisting of ETIM. But under Biden's administration, I think that there would be a rethink of. I'm pretty sure that they are taking stock of what the current administration is doing, and they would have to mend their ways in their if they want to be a part of the great power competition that is happening as an effective part of this great power competition that is happening in Asia. and in the larger Asia Pacific region. So I think that as I have said that this strategy is not working. There is it is this my assessment is backed by this paper that was recently published by Rand Corporation and another recent publication of East West Center. And if you look at, if you see how the countries Southeast Asia, the regional response towards the US-China great power competition, if you look at the response, you could see that there is this wariness, there is this,
Yes.
there is clearly these countries are disgruntled. Yes, there are certain countries, for example, in Vietnam, we are seeing this certain tilt. In Singapore, we are seeing certain tilt. But you look at countries like Malaysia, you look at Indonesia, you look at Thailand. There is they clearly see no incentive in being a part of this rivalry, in supporting one party, and by one party that means United States. They don't want to be a part of this geopolitical competition. They just want to focus on their economy. They just want to focus on this. They want to they want to deal with the pandemic. They want to focus on their economies, and they are not looking at anything. In fact, I don't want to go into that. I won't take much time, so that we can move to other discussion. But you go through that report and you look at how in the assessment that has been made when these researchers at East West Center they try to gauge Indonesia's response towards they try to gauge Indonesia's response towards this geopolitical rivalry, and you look at the response and you realize, okay, so you realize that there is something really wrong with. Let's go through the response, because hold on.
I remember one thing. I remember coming across this recent statement a few weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago, by Indonesia's naval chief. And remarking at a conference, he categorically said, without taking any names, that this power competition going on is something which is regretted, and he continuously stressed that participants will have to ensure that the centrality of ASEAN is ensured. He very much stressed, and he expressed his concerns that that is something which I think he was trying to say, that the great powers were, not being mindful of that factor.
Yes. In fact, the response that has been given, the assessment that has been made on with regards to the Indonesian government, they have clearly written Jakarta seems to count on China as the more important economic partner, even as it confronts China's aggressiveness in the Natuna Sea in areas claimed by and that are part of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. So, despite the contestation of the contestation with regards to the siege that is going on, there is still this realization that economically we are interdependent of China, and there is clearly written that they are focused on addressing the pandemic and economic recovery. They don't want to deal with, and another more interesting thing. So in this assessment, that there is written that the relations between the United States and Indonesia in the last 2 decades have been framed by the so-called comprehensive strategic partnership. However, a takeoff in commercial and security relations has yet to materialize. So nothing has happened in the past 20 years. They are not if being a shrewd player in international politics. They won't want to hedge something that is they wouldn't want to favor something that is detrimental to their core interest. This is just what I discussed about Indonesia. You go through the responses of other countries and you see that there is a similar pattern. So if you, even if they are trying to aggressively, if the US is trying to aggressively push this agenda of Indo-Pacific, 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 I
The
don't
rhetoric,
think
basically,
the rhetoric, it won't, this rhetoric is not geared up to match
not going to yield
the,
any dividends.
it's not going to yield any dividends. It's not geared to match up the reality, the ground realities.
Indeed, indeed. Well, that was very interesting. That's the roundup you have presented. So I think I, for one, have gotten to understand the crux of what we can expect in the foreseeable future from the state and defense departments, because that's what we are particularly concerned with from a national security point of view. I'd like to discuss now one of my most intriguing topics, which I have been studying over the past week or so. Russia's desire to establish a naval logistics base in Sudan. Now, I think in the previous or the episode before that, we discussed, I think it was episode two or three, episode three, if I remember, we discussed the developments in the Horn of Africa, and we were discussing it from a very multinational angle, especially the role of Turkey and the UAE. But here we have Russia out, the great bear, the Eurasian power, finally setting up its presence in the Indian Ocean region. I think that was something which was long overdue, irrespective of the fact that whether everyone in the region will be pleased or not, that's a different debate altogether. But the fact that Russia has finally decided to come. So I'll first be discussing the salience of this particular base which is going to be constructed, and then I'll present a historical context as to how this thing came about, basically. We have been focusing too much on the Western Indian Ocean, but I think that for some people they might consider this to be too abrupt and unexpected, the Russia's entry into Indian Ocean waters. So the first thing is that Russia has insisted a draft of this agreement with Sudan. It is actually available for reading in the Russian language on the Russian government websites. You can read the document. Now, my Russian is very poor, so apart from one or two basic words, I had to rely on Google Translate and a few commentaries to understand the gist of it, because people who are generally posting news reports, they tend to be unreliable. So I had to read the contents of the draft myself to try to understand as best as I could what it actually portends. Um, so basically, the base which Russia wants to construct, Russia insists that it is not a military base but rather a naval logistics facility. Now, I get quite wary of these misnomers and attempts to hide the actual purpose of what those establishments are supposed to be. I mean, obviously, when you're having a logistics setup over there, you're having troops stationed over there. That is what actually makes a base. I mean, what else is a base? So whether or not it's intended for an offensive combat capability, or it's just for defensive purposes or replenishment, in this case, according to what we know, it is meant for replenishment of naval forces. So that gives it a defensive orientation. But the interesting thing is that it is situated in Port Sudan. Once again, as in the previous episode when I was discussing the Horn of Africa, you remember we discussed the new IRGC base in Sirik. I mentioned the distance because the distance between key cities is important, the centers of political power. So this port where Russia intends to set up its base, and it will, is situated. If you look at Google Maps, Port Sudan is directly opposite Makkah and Jeddah. It's directly opposite. I mean, if you open the map and if you just point a straight line from Port Sudan, it will go toward Makkah. the holy site of Muslims. So no relation over here, but the fact that the distance between Jeddah and Port Sudan is just 310 kilometers or something. It's barely 330 kilometers. So we are talking about a short distance in the Red Sea. So a Russian presence directly opposite the key port city of Saudi Arabia, and obviously the religious site of Muslims. So that's the geographic aspect. The draft agreement was released on 11 November, and it says that Russia will have access to the land for 25 years. And that's not a long time because all of China's agreements and some other countries, including Turkey, just to give you an example, Turkey has also leased a Sudani island by the name of Sualin. It is in the middle of the Red Sea, and Turkey has leased it for 99 years. We know that China has leased Hambantota port in Sri Lanka for 99 years, and so 25 years is not that big a deal when you talk about port agreements and establishing bases overseas. Especially not if you consider that Djibouti is nearby, American forces, French forces, Chinese forces, Japanese forces, their agreements go much longer. So this is 25 years. They say that after every 10 years you can consider a renewal. So it can go on. So at least for a quarter of a century, you can definitely expect Russian presence. So the agreement states that Russia will be allowed to dock at least a minimum of 4 ships at a time. I'm sorry, not minimum, but maximum. No more than 4 ships at a time. It could be a destroyer, it could be a frigate, it could be a patrol boat, it could be a submarine, including nuclear powered ships. But no more than 300 personnel are allowed to be in that base. So this is 100 or 200 personnel less than the presence of American forces in Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti. So Russia will not have that much of a true presence as compared to neighboring Djibouti, where the US has its presence, along with China, France, India, Italy, Japan. Okay, so some of the salients are that Russia will have the right to import and export any weapons, ammunition, and equipment necessary, quote unquote, for the operation of the base and performance of tasks by warships. What could be the tasks by warships? So, obviously, warships are not supposed to be there for just replenishment. What do you mean by tasks? I think that vague wording itself, you know how law goes, you can interpret it, the language is set a bit loose, so you can maneuver it and exploit it the way you want to. And then it says that, interestingly, the Sudani government has made it clear that by signing this document, Russia has assured that protection of the borders of water area and its air defense will be up to Russia. So basically, the Sudani government has itself, of its own choosing, absolved of any responsibilities and handed over Russia to take care of its own security in the area. Air defense, obviously, you can expect air defense batteries to be installed over there.
Indeed,
And
quite an interesting choice of words.
indeed. And the other thing is, which caught my attention, is that not only has Sudan given it away, they have kept some quid pro quo for themselves, and they say that should the need arise for the Sudani government, the Russian side, quote unquote, can assist in the organization and implementation of underwater counter sabotage support in the territorial waters of Sudan, participate in search and rescue operations, help provide air defense for local naval forces, which means Sudani naval forces, and strengthen capabilities of Sudanese armed forces. Unquote. So basically, I think as far as bargaining goes, the Sudani government has not just completely handed over its land and territory to Russia as the Sri Lankans did by signing the Status of Forces Agreement with America. They've actually ensured that if they are themselves at risk as far as the land and naval territory is concerned, then Russia will be there to help them. I think, as far as the bargaining point of view goes, it's a good agreement. And just to inform the people who might not be aware, Russia already has a naval base in Tartus, Syria, which is nearby. So if you just go almost 1,000 kilometers to the north of Port of Sudan, there is the Tartus port, and in between we have Turkey and Israel, and then you have Egypt and the Suez Canal. So basically, you have a Turkish presence in the Mediterranean, and now this presence in the Red Sea. So when we talk about the link, so on both sides of Suez Canal, on both sides of the link actually between Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, Russia has kept its foothold over there. And in one of my next topics for discussion in this episode, I will tell you how this is connected to something else also. Coming back to this particular development, so just to let the audience know that why Sudan. The context of it is that the previous Sudani leadership under Omar al-Bashir, who was, many people proclaim that he is a dictator, and he was ousted, he was deposed, he was fiercely opposed to US intervention in the region, and he tried his best to stop the secession of Sudan into North and South Sudan. And what happens was that these agreements, the initial discussions for this development, which is coming to materialize in this year and the next, took place during Omar al-Bashir's rule, and he was very close to Moscow as far as geopolitical proximity is concerned and convergence of interests. Russia had actually initially tried to set its foothold in Djibouti, just like all the other countries we have repeatedly mentioned in our episodes. Japan, Italy, France, China, and the US already in Djibouti. So Russia was actually eyeing Djibouti as well, and from 2012 to 14, negotiations were held between Russia and Djibouti for a facility. However, what happened was that the government of Djibouti at the time, they gave a very inconvenient and um, quote unquote uncomfortable place for the Russians, in a place which was quite barren, and it was not conducive for their operational interests. And so what happened was that after a gap of a few years, in November 2017, the former Sudani ruler Omar Bashir, he visited Moscow and he held a meeting with Putin, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and he pitched him the idea of Port of Sudan, the one which has taken place now in 2017. It was he who offered Port Sudan on a plate to Putin, and quote unquote the words which he used to describe this place is Moscow's key to Africa. This is what he was quoted as saying. And now this is something which is important. The Russian ambassador to, so this was in 2017, the end. Next year in 2018, the Russian ambassador to Sudan, Vladimir Giltov, he said that his country was discussing the establishment of this center, and he clarified repeatedly to the press that was in attendance at the Russian embassy. He said that I would like to assure you that it is not a military base, it is going to be a naval logistics supply center. Again, an interesting play of words going on over there. So, all this process basically started from 2017 as far as eyeing Sudan is concerned. But what we do know that overall, if we look at Russia's intent to enter into Africa, they were interested since 2012. So we're talking 8 years ago almost. Okay, so the reason why Omar Bashir offered Port Sudan on a plate to Putin is again quid pro quo. You see, the history is showing that the Sudanese are good in bargaining with regional powers. And what did Omar Bashir want in return? He wanted to purchase Sukhoi 30 jets and Sukhoi 35 jets, including S-300 air defense systems. He wanted to completely shift his country's military forces on Russian platforms so that they are in a position in which they could not be compromised by the Americans or other actors. Now, this is something which I'm going to share some important observations by think tanks based in the West to understand their perspective on this. The Warsaw Institute, which is based in Poland, it notes that, quote, a Russian base located only 300 kilometers from Jeddah would be considered by Saudi Arabia as a threat to its security as well as to the security of oil and gas supplies from the Persian Gulf to Europe. So basically, according to the Warsaw Institute, Port Sudan, the Russian presence over there, is going to be perceived as a threat by Saudi Arabia, and rightfully so. But then we also have The Economist, a renowned publication, writing in October 2018, I quote, Russia's new interest in the Central African republics is indicative of its willingness to increase its influence on the African continent and to counterbalance the influence of traditional powers such as the US, UK, and France. Russia also provides a counterbalance to Chinese influence, which has increased in recent years owing to China's large scale infrastructure Belt and Road Initiative. Unquote. And so this is The Economist commenting, but let me just repeat the timeline which I mentioned. So 2017 in November, Omar Bashir visits Moscow. He offers Port Sudan on a plate. June 2018, Russia's ambassador in Sudan acknowledges their interest and claims that it is going to be a naval logistics supply center. So a few months later, in August 2018, now this is interesting. These are some uh, different facts which I have compiled into one just to inform you of how entrenched Russia is going to be in this particular area. Russia signed an agreement for a Russian industrial zone and nuclear power plant in Egypt, August 2018. So this is just 2 or 3 months after expressing their interest in Sudan. Now, just to let the audience know, Egypt borders Sudan. So there you have it if you're talking about the geographical point of view. So to the north of Sudan, you have Egypt. Russia has established its industrial zone in Egypt and a nuclear power plant. So you have those strong interests over there, your stakes over there, not just the political or security, but also economic stakes. Number one. Number two, now this is a country which is to the east of Sudan, which is Eritrea. It is a small country, Eritrea, and UAE has a strong influence over there. We discussed it in the previous episode. Uh, Russia has also, in August 2018, the same month, set up signed an agreement for a logistics base in Eritrea. So basically, Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, the three main countries in the Red Sea. Now, Sudan and Eritrea come in the Horn of Africa. Egypt is not. Egypt is in the Suez Canal. But it just goes to show you that from the tip of Tartus in Syria, along the shores of Israel toward Egypt and coming till Eritrea at least, you have a strong Russian military presence. Now, let me just get out of the portion of salients and let's now discuss why Russia is going to have a conducive environment in Africa. Well, Russia has been quite an anomalous player as far as power competition in Africa and the Western Indian Ocean goes. We all know that India and the US and its allies have common interests in the region. We know that China is following its own path with African countries. Russia, interestingly, Russia has complete uh, synchronicity with the Egyptian military. And the Egyptians have recently been acquiring a lot of defense hardware from Russia and engaged in technical cooperation, including intelligence cooperation. So I think the Russians have played it very safe, and I think it goes to their benefit that they did not agree to a timid base in Djibouti, because the sort of access which Sudan is going to give, definitely it is going to irk Saudi Arabia. But if we look at it in the current developments, it was a long time ago when there were some issues going on, many years ago, between the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt and Saudi Arabia was irked by its presence over there. Since President Sisi assumed power, he came and assumed his autocracy over there. He is basically a like-minded strategic ally, not just of Saudi Arabia, but also all the major GCC countries, including Israel. and their common interest is going against Turkey. Now, I think that the Russians, now that they have kept themselves as a standalone actor in Sudan, I haven't come across any other actor except Turkey, but Turkey has taken control of a small island in Sudan for economic purposes, nothing to do with the security purposes. So that is going to create a very, very complex um, potpourri of these regional power actors that have suddenly decided that, okay, the Pacific might be a theater, but the interesting thing is that everybody seems to be coming toward the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa all of a sudden, because I think very few people realize that it is not just the Pacific theater or the Atlantic theater. It is now we are seeing. I mean, obviously, various developments come into play. The Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean is getting deeply interconnected with time. If you remember, one of my recent perspective papers in which I discussed East Africa, and I mentioned in it that the Chinese had already, when they were laying the groundwork for BRI and Maritime Silk Route, the Chinese had already foreseen that the key routes to global trade and geostrategic importance is from Indian Ocean, East Africa till Mediterranean, that ocean belt over there. And the fact that Russia is going to be right next to Djibouti also, and you can just imagine the sort of panic going on in American military circles over there. So what are we going to witness? Well, for a matter of fact, right now the situation is that Russian interests aside, we can debate about Russia's own interests as far as we want. Russia is also entering into good engagements with the UAE, and interestingly, the UAE leader of the UAE, he inaugurated two important military facilities in Egypt several months ago, earlier this year. The Port Berenice, and there was another base, I forget the name. So CC had specially invited him. So if you look at the alliance going on over there, the geopolitical alliance, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, now we have Sudan, because Sudan, again, Sudan has normalized its relations with Israel. So the Russians at least know that now the regime over there is not going to be hostile towards that Mediterranean country. And that is, and recently we read this news of Israel's intelligence chief and the prime minister visiting a particular Arab country. I won't mention the name over here. If you look at these things in context, the maritime aspect of it, I am just going to try to understand why Russia now it decided that it wants to come into this arena, and the fact of the matter remains that this is a confirmation that the Mediterranean supply route connecting the Red Sea has now formally been acknowledged as the flashpoint of contestation between these regional players. Up until now, we were talking about some basic exercises going on. The China, just all these countries having just a basic basis for supply and etc. You see, the question remains a pertinent question. Russia already had its comprehensive and base and infrastructure in Tartus. It practically controls the entire and influences the entire Syrian military. If Why does it need another presence close to the Red Sea? I mean, Tartus is not that far away from the Red Sea. It is very easy for their surface vessels to come for replenishment, and from those over here to go when passing over there. But why set up another one? I think that there are more questions than answers, and this actually indicates the shift, and this has actually raised the temperature to a considerable notch. And one of the last points which I am going to mention over here is the fact that if this agreement is to be believed in letter and spirit, what we are going to see is that Russia will also ensure that its base is secure from. I mean, Okay, we could talk about the Houthi presence in Yemen. So it's basically near to the south of Saudi Arabia. What will the Iranians be doing now? Because the Houthis have been consistently trying to target rocket attacks towards Saudi Arabia. Now that Russia is also involved in the picture, and the air defense aspect of the whole region is going to be a complex mashup going on over there. How will the Iranians react, and how will Iran react to this whole thing? Will Iran be allowed to replenish its naval vessels in this Russian base in Sudan? Number one. So that is also a question. I'm sure this is something which the Saudis and Egypt, but particularly the Saudis, will be wondering, will Russia allow IRGC or Iranian Navy vessels to come and replenish in the Sudani base? If yes, then that is going to spark a lot of conflict. If not, then it would indicate otherwise, that Russia is operating independently in the Indian Ocean and it does not need any allies. I think the fact of the matter that Russia, out of all countries, it has exceptional strategic relations with Iran. It did not consider setting up any base in Iran. And for the matter of fact, you see, if we talk in military terms, Chabahar is basically not a military base, but Russia had that option to set up a facility over there or near there with India and Iran, but it chose Sudan out of all places. So that also indicates that it is not yet ready to rely on any littoral country in the Indian Ocean for its interests, and it would rather prefer to have a setup directly in the Red Sea, but away from the main Horn of Africa, so that it can have direct access to the Mediterranean region as and when it wants. Now, if you have a rear beachhead in Tartus and you have a presence in Sudan till Eritrea, now again Eritrea also, I think this just goes to show that Russia has played its cards well. So I am particularly I am impressed that the Russians have indeed played their cards very well over here.
It was always a pleasure to learn from your astute insights into what's happening in Africa. Since you dedicated a lot of time looking at what's happening in the region and figuring out the broader trends that are happening. So from we talked about Red Sea, Mediterranean. Now we are moving towards the Atlantic. So let's discuss France, Germany, and their relations with the United States. So in the past few days, we have seen this very widely read piece, an interview given by Emmanuel Macron, French president, to a media portal known as the Lee Grand Continent. This was quite an extensive interview, and it has created a buzz in Germany, and so there is this German defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. So she had also gone on the offensive once this interview of Macron was released. So she actually wrote an opinion piece, and Macron responded to that piece in his interview. The issue is related to European defense capabilities and of European dependence on the United States. So, in an op-ed that was previously written, Kallenbauer called Europe's strategic autonomy an illusion, quote unquote.
Okay.
Yes. And Macron stated that he profoundly disagreed, quote unquote, he profoundly disagreed with the opinion piece written by the German Minister of Defense. And he considered it to be another quote start point, historical misinterpretation, quote end point. So there is this discussion going on about this. So Karen Bauer said that the illusionary idea of Europe's strategic autonomy must come to an end, as
Oh,
Europe cannot replace America as a security guarantor. Uh, in her opinion, the idea of European autonomy goes too far if it feeds this illusion that security, stability, and prosperity can be guaranteed in Europe without NATO and the United States. So, we know this that Macron has always stressed that European defense is foremost. Uh, NATO comes second, US comes second. And Macron has always stressed on European autonomy in its defense matters. France
the Europe
wants
first
to,
policy.
yes, France wants to be prepared for the day when the United States is no longer able or willing to guarantee European security. But Germany, on the other hand, it wants to strengthen the European pillar of NATO to convince the US to maintain its presence in Europe. Although both Germany and France agrees that Europe should do more, but for Macron, Europe should do more independently, and it shouldn't rely on the United States. But for Germany, Europe should do more to strengthen itself and an incentive for the United States to maintain its presence in Europe. So Europe,
Basically, what you're trying to say, can you just clarify for my knowledge, because this is quite interesting, the comparisons you've drawn. Are you saying that basically the security architecture which France prefers is Eurocentric and European led, whereas Germany wants a reliance on the transatlantic structure which is in place through NATO? That's what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, there is this suspicion in Berlin that Macron wants to weaken NATO.
Oh.
Yes, and it's a very dangerous suspicion. And it is also possible that what this hullabaloo that happened with regards to what Macron said, what the German Defense Minister Karen Bauer said, it is also possible that Germany, especially Karen Bauer, through her opinion piece, has conveyed to the Americans that Germany needs them and value their help. Also, in the German Ministry of Defense, there seems to be concern that some elements of the German political opposition are a bit too enthusiastic about the idea of European autonomy. Not because they want to bolster the European defense efforts, rather it is precisely the extreme misinterpretation of European autonomy without the United States that is attractive to them.
Okay.
And I was going through this this survey today. There were these two surveys that I've gone through, in which there is this Survey was done amongst the German population, and 51% of the German populace considers echoes the same sentiment as the French president.
Okay.
Yes, 51% of the respondents echoed the same opinion
Have
as.
they tried to mention what could be the reasons for this preference?
No. I'll have to go through the complete report. I think it was published in
If I'm
National
just
Council of
because several many episodes ago when PGR podcast was limited to audio only on Anchor, I covered this aspect that the German Parliament has been fighting viciously about extending troop deployments in Afghanistan, and I think that that terrible experience with NATO in Afghanistan. This is not just the definitive opinion, but one of the main factors which I've been reading over the past 6 months as far as German military goes. That the Germans at that time also there was a survey. The Germans were considerably upset and they were fed up of the lack of response and support they were receiving from NATO, including funds from the US, and that had actually influenced the Bundestag, the German Parliament, to factor in before deciding on troop deployment. Obviously, Merkel did go ahead and try to influence it in favor, but I think that is one of the factors which needs to be kept. I mean, practically speaking, the German experience with NATO and these allies, it hasn't been that conducive on ground, has it?
No, precisely. That is one reason that you have given here. There are two other. In fact, there is another important reason. See, in inner peace, Karen Bauer also warned about the rising anti-American sentiment in the German public, and she has cautioned about it that this thing is happening, and this thing would further inflame if these kind of discussions would come to the fore. Also, we know this that the Germans have a very strong opinion on nuclear weapons. They reject nuclear weapons. So this can also be one of the reasons of why Germans are not favoring the Americans. And if you look at it from the German government's point of view, so they are concerned about it because if Germany ends up losing support of its transatlantic partner, the United States, it would lose the nuclear umbrella, and there and there are no European capabilities that they
Russia,
shall. Yes,
Russia being a main factor.
yes, exactly. There is no replacement of that. So, and Karen Bauer, at another point of time, she gave this speech and she's talked about the cost of strategic autonomy. If there is this complete detachment from the United States, it would be disproportionately higher than the 2% to GDP that the Germans contribute to the transatlantic alliance. The cost of maintaining defense on our own, it would be higher than the 2% that they contribute to
Definitely.
NATO. Uh, France perhaps doesn't care about it as much because France already is a nuclear power. They have this nuclear deterrent that the Germans don't have. And Germans have to rely on the Americans. So you can see this interesting divergence on this question of strategic autonomy, these debates going on in Europe. about how dependent we should be on the United States. Uh, so,
I think
what's
that,
yes?
I wanted to ask you related to this. Does that explain why countries such as France and now even Germany have decided they have to act on their own in the Indo-Pacific theater, what they call the Indo-Pacific? I mean, they're not joining the, that's something to note, they're not joining the US-led alliance, or they're going completely independent over there and acting autonomously. So ultimately, I think in the long run, if these two European strong countries with strong militaries, they are venturing overseas beyond the European territory into an extra regional theater and acting of their own accord, does that also not speak volumes about their long term vision for limited cooperation with the US?
Uh, Yes, that is one angle, but that is one angle. Additionally, if you look, I don't I, in the Biden administration, I think this cooperation, France can Emmanuel Macron can go on claiming whatever he want, but the transatlantic alliance is not uh, cannot the politics around the transatlantic alliance cannot dissipate so easily
Indeed.
because it would further strengthen. Uh, that is my opinion.
I'm sorry to speculate, but before I continue, I begin my next topic. I just like to add that you see, Germany has more reasons than France to be concerned about retaining partnership with US. And the fact of that matter is that Germany is home to many of NATO installations and US overseas bases as compared to France. So the sort of integration which the US military and influence which it has on the German politic and society in general is starkly different than that of France. You don't see that in France as much as you see in Germany also. So yes, there are a lot of considerations on that point as well. So speaking of Europe, I think we moved from Africa to Europe. I'm also going to talk of Europe. This is going to be my last topic for this episode. I came across this news that the US Army Europe, I repeat myself, not US European Command, that is the entire combatant command. I'm talking about just US Army component in Europe. It has formally consolidated itself with US Army Africa. So basically, the European Command and African Command already had consolidated air and naval forces. So US naval forces, Africa and Europe were already integrated at the service level. Same goes for the Navy. It is just now in 2020 that the land forces component has also been integrated. I fail to understand why they have not combined the commands itself, the theaters. I think they want to retain that sort of a strategic distinction between the two: European Command, EUCOM, to remain different from Africa Command, AFRICOM. But now the interesting thing is that the consolidation of US Army Europe and Africa has been renamed to US Army Europe and Africa, which is USAREUR hyphen AF, US Areur slash AF. And basically, US Army Africa, the Southern European Task Force, is redesignated as US Army Southern European Task Force Africa. So before I continue any further, I'm just trying to point out the fact that as far as the geostrategic posturing of US military is concerned, the land forces, they now consider Europe and Africa to be part of the same theater. This is very important.
Very important.
And the two-star general in charge of erstwhile US Army Africa, he will now serve as the deputy commanding general for the new consolidated command. So basically, he was only looking after the African task force. Now he will serve as a deputy on the forum which will look into Africa and Europe combined, which makes sense as far as structuralism is concerned. Now, there is an interesting statement by the Secretary of US Army, Mr. Ryan McCarthy, he said that this integration between European and African army commands will, quote, play a vital role in supporting missions across two interconnected theaters of operation, unquote. I think the key takeaway from that statement is interconnected theaters of operation. You see, the interesting thing is now that I'd like to remind the viewers about the previous topic which I discussed: Russian presence in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So now we all know that Russia and China are the two most top priority strategic threats for the US according to their annual assessments and State Department reports, etc. So, can you see? I'm just trying to point out this is what I believe, that obviously the Russian materialization of presence in Africa did not take a few months, it is the culmination of several years. Same goes for the US. So now Russia has ensured Russia does not have that sort of a theater command difference. It's basically functioning in the Mediterranean as it considers the entire region. It's Southern Fleet and the European Fleet. Now the US is going to completely encapsulate the Mediterranean and African shores into its fold. So basically, from Atlantic Ocean till the Western Indian Ocean, you will have the land forces having autonomy to traverse about in the region to protect their interests with greater integration as compared to the bureaucratic paperwork which had divided the African component between the European component. So now that operational synergy, that integration of resources, the removal of duplication, I think that amalgamation is going to play extremely efficiently for US interests. Just to let the audience know, the US Africa Command is not based on Africa at all. It has no African presence. And it is actually based, the US Army Europe is based in Wiesbaden, Germany. It's based in Germany, okay? US Army Europe. So I don't see the headquarters changing at least for a few years. So that presence in Germany is now even more important. And the US Army Africa headquarters was based until recently in Vicenza, Italy. So now the German and Italian headquarters are going to be integrated. Where? That hasn't been discussed yet, that hasn't been provided yet. There is a scarce information about that. So, what we have come to know is that, just to let the audience know about the scope. So now we have to understand how big is this theater command, how big is European command, how big is Africa command. Let's begin with European command. The EUCOM covers 51 countries, including Europe, Russia, and Israel. Now, these are some of the prominent countries which I have selected. So, European Command as a whole, Army, Navy, Air Force, covers 51 countries, including Russia and Israel and Europe. Okay, and its mandate extends to the shore of Africa. So, until before this integration, US Army Europe could not operate beyond the shores of North Africa. It could not enter into the African mainland. That was exclusively for US Army Africa. And Africa Command, AFRICOM, covers 53 countries, essentially the entire Africa except Egypt, because Egypt is the only African country which is not part of AFRICOM. It comes under Central Command, CENTCOM. Pakistan is also a part of CENTCOM. So now what will happen is the US Army Europe's domain. Just imagine, I think this has to be one of the largest integrations and command operational areas ever as far as Europe, US military is concerned. So the US Army Europe and Africa integrated will not only deal with Africa, it will also deal now with Russia, Israel, Europe. Just imagine the sort of disparate politics in play and the sort of disparate security architectures being combined together.
Yes.
I think, just imagine going from all the way from, and Greenland is also part of European Command. So we begin with Greenland. and we end at South Africa. Just imagine the scope and scale of this area of operations for the US Army.
Correct.
And
Fascinating. See,
and the just
these two different theater of operations are now single. I've now been merged together.
Exactly. And I think the last thing which I would like to point out is that there were some people who were saying, well, if the Navy and Air Force were already integrated at their own service levels and the Army is now being integrated, why not just combine the whole theaters together? So there was some resistance on this by the US House Armed Services Committee Chairman, Mr. Adam Smith. He opposed the consolidation of the entire theaters. So I personally I can understand the technicalities of this, because if you integrate the entire commands, combatant commands, that will send a very wrong signals. So what they've done is that at the higher headquarter level, headquarter Africa Command and headquarter European Command, they've ensured that their dealings with African countries and Europe, Russia, etc., will remain separate as far as the higher headquarters are concerned. But as far as operational and tactical level dealings are concerned, there will be integration. So, as far as the high level politics and interaction is concerned, I think there is not going to be any difference. And this very clearly shows that if the theaters are not integrated, but only their specific subcomponents, their Army, Navy, and Air Force, because just to let you know, the when we talk about European Command and not just Army Europe, we are talking about civilian subject matter experts who are proficient in the regional customs, traditions, politics, and security considerations, apprehensions among the local populace in those target areas. So I think what America has done is they have tried to retain that sort of a distinction between Europe and Russia on the one end, and the entire African continent on the other. But I think to save up their resources, or to try to make up for their absence on the African continent, to send a message to China and Russia, perhaps, especially China. This should be a message to China, basically, that as far as the operational forces are concerned, they will have the option to fly from Europe and even operate till the shores of South Africa if need be. They couldn't do that before. And AFRICOM has a very limited presence in Africa. They're involved in very few counter-terrorism missions against terrorist organizations, Al Qaeda, and this and that, and trying to train local African countries to strengthen their military forces, respective forces. So I think this is something. Now again, we talked about Russia entering, trying to consolidate Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean. We are seeing the same with the US now.
Before we close this session, Zaki, I would like your take on this point that you have made with regards to the distinction on between these two commands on the strategic level, but on the operational and tactical level, there would be integration. So my question is, or what I am puzzled about is, uh, how would they create synergy on the operational and tactical level? Because when we go through this subject of jointness, when we study jointness, we get this distinct sense that jointness on the strategic level is easier as compared to how that jointness would translate on the lower levels. So these two different commands, uh, how they would deal with, how they would synergize their efforts on the operational and tactical level. This is something that is I want your comment on.
Well, again, to reiterate that, you see, the entire theater command comprises of various elements. They have political elements, they have subject matter experts, civilians who are consultants to the general officer who leads the combatant command in the area. And then you have army commands, you have intelligence components, you have the air force, the navy, and there are multiple components. So if I can just restrict myself to the military domain components, army, navy, air force, the integration at from strategic till tactical level has already been there for navy and air forces. Just to give you an example,
Oh yes. Oh yes. Okay.
that has already been there. So they have that sufficient experience that the Camp Lemonie in Djibouti, there are elements of US Army and US Navy also already working over there. The issue was that US Army and again US Army's US Army Africa's headquarters also was the entire AFRICOM setup itself has already been based in Europe. So the reason they are based in Europe is because that is the beachhead from where they thrust into North Africa as
Yes.
and when need be. We saw that happening in Libya. If you remember when they wanted to depose Muammar Gaddafi, the operation carried out in tandem with NATO. The aircraft came from Europe and they flew into North Africa. They crossed the Mediterranean. So that has already
They
been there.
they come from Italy, cross the
Exactly.
Mediterranean, going to Africa. This is what happened in World War II. If you look at the past patterns, and to complement this, perhaps we can have this discussion on this development in some other session of the scheme of things. You look at what's happening. The this news of U.S. First Fleet. Uh,
Oh yes, well that turned out to be a big embarrassment for the Americans and the MINDEF, the Ministry of Defense in Singapore, which is known to be very extremely cautious when trying to communicate its concerns to the US. It very vociferously came out in time and refuted in clear, unequivocal terms that that is not something that is going to happen, at least not without taking them into confidence. So
just
that
four
just goes to
checks.
show you. Just imagine that a US official made this passing remark and even named the fleet. Just imagine. And, let's just forget the fact that they want to establish something. Singapore, of all places, it is not even in the Indian Ocean, for God's sake. I mean, if you place them in Diego Garcia, that still makes sense. It's a
Yes.
connect between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. But Singapore, of all places, now the problem is, very quickly, Singapore does not want to be involved beyond intelligence sharing with the US and Five Eyes countries. It has participated only once with the US in the Malabar exercises in 2007, the first edition. 2007 is the only year of Malabar exercises which took place twice. Otherwise, it's just a one-time event per year, per annum. And after that, Singapore never again took part in Malabar because Singapore has been very, cautious about sending the wrong signals to China. Singapore does not want to, will never. I'm not saying this with certainty, but I'm saying this with a certain degree of confidence that any US presence in fleet presence in Singapore is out of the question. And with that, before we wrap up this program, I would just like to point out that I am going to write a very comprehensive perspective paper for CSCR. My good friend Talha has encouraged me to evolve it into a perspective paper. It was going to be an article initially on Malabar exercises. It's going to be one of the most comprehensive analyses on this subject. And I'm actually going to have a lot of surprises for the readers and the audience because there has been much hype, and it all started with the Indian media trying to portray it as the culmination of the Quad experience and this and that. But the statistics and the visuals which I will be incorporating in that paper to be published by CSCR, it will give you a very different picture from what is being portrayed, something more objective to tone down the hype which is going on. So thank you, Talha, for giving your time, and it has been quite a roller coaster episode, this one. in particular.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
we have
had
to.
this I had this thing going on where I received some comments from the Indian listeners in the audience, which I appreciate. I have all the respects for the Indian audience to our programs, and some of them ask me, "Oh, you are so obsessed with India." Well, the fact of the matter is, we didn't find anything noteworthy to include India in this particular episode. Not because India is an insignificant country for Pakistan, but because we select topics based on those which we find are most concerning as far as the larger geostrategic developments are concerned. And it was quite refreshing that for once we focused more on Europe and Africa as compared to the traditional Indian Ocean side. So,
Yes, we
Tala,
could
once
have
again,
discussed.
thank you for your time.
Yes, just for your audience, just for the audience, that people from the audience, our Indian listeners who complain to you, we had to discuss RCEP as well today, but due to the paucity of time, we decided to cut it short and call it a night.
Yes, definitely. And RCEP will be, but I'm not going to leave it. That will be discussed in the next episode. And until then, thank you for tuning in, everybody. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.